Hey, look, notice everything have it.
You say you don't want to put it right there. I ain't even doing nothing but laughing. You supposed to write people up that joke on people. That's like bullying. I'm laughing. I'm gonna get rolled up. I don't be quiet. I'll be quiet. I'm gonna do my work. Okay.
Mine's up too, sir. Bob, give me. Maceo, man.
Hop in your bunk. Okay.
Look at that girl.
Look, she said I'm fine. Look. Holla at this freshman. But you can't say your man. Don't be on me. Cause I know you love me.
Slide back up feeling.
For real. Should've leave me. Face just wanna. I feel weird without big earrings. You feel like, come here, girl.
A piece of paper promises protection. A judge's signature offers safety. A restraining order creates a barrier between victim and predator. But what happens when that barrier becomes meaningless? When the system designed to protect becomes the very thing that provides false hope? In courtrooms across America, victims plead for protection. They show their wounds, recount their terror, and place their faith in legal documents that should shield them from harm. But sometimes, the ink on those papers isn't dry before the violence escalates beyond what anyone could have anticipated. This is the story of a young mother who did everything right. She sought help, she followed the rules, she trusted the system. Yet despite every precaution, despite every legal safeguard put in place, her worst fears would become reality in the most devastating way possible. At Truly Criminal Network, our team has investigated countless cases where the system failed those who needed it most. If stories like this make you question how we can do better, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the investigations that matter most. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about protection and justice. Montasia Arrington entered the world on August 16, 2001, in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, bringing with her an infectious joy that would define her entire life. From her earliest moments, she was described as a happy baby, always smiling and showing love to everyone around her. That natural warmth wasn't just a phase of childhood, it became the cornerstone of who Montasia was as a person. Her heart belonged to her family, especially her grandmother, Brenda Royster. In Montasia's world, her grandmother was her heart and soul. When life got complicated, when problems seemed insurmountable, Grandma could fix it. This relationship wasn't just special, it was foundational to understanding the young woman Montasia became. She found strength in these family bonds, drawing comfort from the people who loved her unconditionally. Growing up in Halifax County, Montasia navigated her education with the same positive energy she brought to everything else. She graduated from Northwest Collegiate and Technical Academy in Littleton, North Carolina, with the class of 2019. But academics weren't her only focus. Montasia was an active member of the school's cheer squad, where she cultivated loving relationships with her coaches and teammates. These weren't just extracurricular activities, they were proof of her ability to connect with others, to build supportive relationships that mattered. The tight-knit community of Littleton provided the perfect backdrop for someone like Montasia to flourish. She was surrounded by an extensive network of love. Her parents, Teresa Arrington and Matthew Garner, her siblings Tenika, Takia, Jai, Daizian, and Zakai, and her devoted grandparents, Lloyd and Brenda Royster. Her best friend, Ashanti Jefferson, rounded out a circle of support that seemed unbreakable. But the center of Montasia's universe was her 2-year-old son, Jason Tillery. Becoming a mother at 18 didn't derail her dreams, it refocused them. Every decision she made revolved around creating a better life for her child. She was determined to build a secure, loving future for both of them, no matter what obstacles stood in their way. Montasia possessed a quiet resilience that allowed her to hope for brighter days, even when circumstances grew dark. She understood that being a good mother sometimes meant making difficult choices, even when those choices required tremendous courage. Her determination to break cycles of hardship wasn't just about her own future. It was about the kind of world she wanted to create for Jason. Those who knew Montasia remember her gift for bouncing around, laughing, and playing with family and friends. She had a gentle soul that brought warmth to every room she entered. These weren't just pleasant memories people clung to after tragedy struck. They were the authentic expressions of who Montasia truly was. At 20 years old, Montasia was still becoming the woman she was meant to be. She had dreams that extended beyond her current circumstances, goals that centered around providing stability and love for her son. She believed in the possibility of safety, in the power of fresh starts, and in her ability to overcome whatever challenges life presented. But even as Montasia worked toward building that better future, shadows from her past were growing longer. The father of her son, her former partner, represented a darkness she was actively trying to escape. She had made the difficult decision to leave that relationship behind, recognizing that staying would mean accepting a life defined by fear rather than love. Montasia's story up to this point was one of hope triumphing over adversity. She had the support system, the determination, and the fierce maternal love necessary to build the life she envisioned. She was taking steps to protect herself and her child, following the advice of those who cared about her safety. What Montasia couldn't have known was that sometimes the very act of seeking safety can trigger the most dangerous response from those who are trying to escape. By early 2022, Montasia's life had become a careful balance between hope and survival. The relationship with Jamasia Tillery, the father of her son, had deteriorated into something dangerous. What had once been a connection that brought Jason into the world had transformed into a source of constant fear. Montasia made the brave decision that many domestic violence victims struggle with. She chose to leave. Leaving wasn't simple. Tillery wasn't just her ex-boyfriend. He was Jason's father, which meant their lives would remain connected regardless of her personal safety concerns. But Montasia recognized that staying meant accepting a life where violence could erupt at any moment. She packed up her life and sought refuge in the one place that had always represented safety, her mother's home. Teresa Arrington's apartment on Little Drive, just off Ferguson Street in Littleton, became Montasia's sanctuary. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement. It was supposed to be a new beginning. Here, surrounded by family support, Montasia could rebuild her life on her own terms. She could focus on being the mother Jason deserved without constantly looking over her shoulder. But Jamasia Tillery wasn't prepared to let go. 2 weeks before April 19, 2022, Tillery's anger manifested in the most terrifying way possible. He attacked Montasia with a knife, leaving her physically injured and emotionally shattered. The attack wasn't just violence, it was a message. It demonstrated how far he was willing to go to maintain control over her life. For many domestic violence victims, a knife attack would be the moment they disappear entirely, perhaps moving to another state or going underground. But Montasia had something many victims don't have: faith in the legal system. She believed that if she did everything right, if she followed proper procedures, the law would protect her. Montasia appeared in court, her wounds still healing, and did what countless domestic violence victims do every day. She asked for help. She explained the danger she faced. She requested a domestic violence protective order against Tillery, a legal document that would theoretically create a barrier between them. Her pleas in court weren't just procedural. They were desperate requests from a young mother who wanted nothing more than to raise her son in peace. The court granted her request. The protective order was issued, officially prohibiting Tillery from contacting or approaching Montasia. On paper, she was protected. The system had responded appropriately to her request for help. But the system had another decision to make: what to do with Jamasia Tillery himself. Despite the knife attack, despite the documented pattern of escalating violence, despite Montasia's testimony about the danger she faced, the court set Tillery's bond at $40,000. This wasn't an astronomical amount, it was achievable. And achieve it he did. Montasia Tillery walked out of jail while Montasia remained in hiding. The protective order that was supposed to keep her safe became a piece of paper with no enforcement mechanism. Tillery was free to move around Halifax County while Montasia remained confined to her mother's apartment, afraid to venture out alone. The very system she trusted had created a scenario where her attacker had more freedom than she did. April 19, 2022, started like many other mornings for Montasia. She was at her mother's apartment, probably planning another day of careful routine designed to keep herself and Jason safe. The protective order was in place. Tillery was supposed to stay away. Everything that could be done legally had been done. But that morning, Montasia Tillery made a decision that would destroy multiple families forever. He arrived at Montasia Arrington's apartment unannounced. This wasn't a coincidence or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate violation of the protective order. Tillery knew exactly where to find Montasia because he had always known where she was. The piece of paper ordering him to stay away had never been anything more than an inconvenience. In the moments that followed, the reality of domestic violence revealed itself in its most brutal form. This wasn't about love or passion or relationship dynamics. This was about power and control, and what happens when someone refuses to be controlled. Montasia Arrington found herself facing every parent's worst nightmare, watching someone threaten her child's life. In a moment that defined her as a mother, Montasia pushed Montasia aside, urging her to seek safety, to protect herself at all costs. Montasia was willing to put herself between her daughter and danger, to shield Montasia from the violence that was about to unfold. But Montasia Tillery had come prepared for violence. He had brought a firearm, and he was prepared to use it. The attack happened quickly. Tillery opened fire inside the apartment where Montasia had sought refuge. The young woman who had done everything right, who had followed every legal procedure, who had trusted the system to protect her, was fatally shot. Her 20 years of life, her dreams for her son's future, her hopes for a fresh start, all of it ended in the place where she thought she was safest. Montasia Arrington, the mother who tried to shield her daughter, was also shot. She sustained serious injuries while trying to protect both Montasia and her 2-year-old grandson. The violence that was supposed to be contained by a protective order had now spread to claim multiple victims. 2-year-old Jason was in the apartment when his father murdered his mother. Though physically unharmed, he witnessed the destruction of his entire world. In a matter of moments, he lost his mother and watched his grandmother get hurt, all at the hands of the man whose DNA he carried. When the gunfire stopped, 3 lives were irrevocably changed. Montasia was dead. Montasia was gravely injured, and Jason was left with trauma that would follow him for the rest of his life. The sanctuary that was supposed to protect Montasia had become the scene of her murder. The protective order meant to keep her safe had failed in the most absolute way possible. The system she trusted had let her down when she needed it most. These are the moments that challenge everything we think we know about justice, protection, and the value of seeking help through proper channels. For families across the country dealing with domestic violence, Montasia's story represents their worst fears realized. If this case makes you question how we can better protect domestic violence victims, you're not alone. The failures here demand our attention and our action. The investigation into Montasia Arrington's murder began with one significant advantage. There was no mystery about who was responsible. Montasia Tillery's identity as the shooter was immediately clear to responding officers. This wasn't a case that would require months of detective work to identify a suspect. The challenge was finding him. When law enforcement arrived at Montasia Arrington's apartment on Little Drive, they found a scene of devastating violence. But they also found immediate clarity about the perpetrator's identity. The domestic violence context, the protective order violation, and witness accounts all pointed directly to Montasia Tillery. What they didn't find was Tillery himself. He had fled the scene immediately after the shooting, and by the time officers secured the area, he was already gone. This presented Littleton police with an urgent manhunt situation. They weren't just looking for a murder suspect, they were hunting someone who had just demonstrated his willingness to kill and who had a documented history of violence against intimate partners. Every moment he remained free represented a potential threat to public safety. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Littleton's borders when authorities determined that Tillery had fled to Raleigh. This wasn't just someone trying to hide locally. He had put significant distance between himself and the crime scene. The decision to flee to another city suggested either a planned escape route or connections that could help him evade capture. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Littleton police reached out for assistance from the United States Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force. This wasn't unusual for cases involving violent suspects who had crossed jurisdictional lines, but it demonstrated the commitment to apprehending Tillery quickly. The Marshals Service specializes in tracking down fugitives, and their involvement sent a clear message about the priority being placed on this case. While the manhunt continued, investigators began building a comprehensive picture of exactly who Jamesia Tillery was. The initial focus was straightforward. He was Montasia's ex-boyfriend and the father of her child. The domestic violence context was immediately apparent, but as detectives dug deeper into Tillery's background, they uncovered information that transformed their understanding of the case entirely. Jamesia Tillery wasn't just someone with relationship problems who had escalated to violence. He was a registered sex offender with a documented history of predatory behavior. This discovery added layers of complexity to what was already a devastating case. The details of Tillery's criminal history painted a disturbing picture. On April 5, 2017, he had been convicted of felonious restraint of a minor and sexual battery. The victim in that case was just 14 years old, and the offenses had occurred on January 30, 2016. Tillery received 30 months of probation and was added to the North Carolina Sex Offender Registry on April 7, 2017, for a minimum period of 10 years. He had been released from prison in 2019, just 3 years before he murdered Montasia. This timeline was crucial for understanding the risk factors that had been present in Montasia's relationship. She had been involved with someone who not only had a history of violence, but specifically a history of sexual violence against minors. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation maintains a public sex offender registry designed to inform communities about individuals who pose documented risks. Tillery's inclusion on this registry meant that information about his criminal history was publicly available to anyone who knew where to look. But for many domestic violence victims, checking sex offender registries isn't part of their safety planning process. This revelation reframed everything investigators thought they knew about the case. This wasn't just domestic violence. It was domestic violence perpetrated by someone with a documented pattern of predatory behavior. Montasia hadn't just been trying to escape an abusive relationship. She had been trying to protect herself and her son from someone whose criminal history suggested he posed multiple types of threats. The manhunt for Tillery concluded successfully when he was located and taken into custody in Raleigh. The coordination between Littleton Police and the U.S. Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force had worked. Tillery's attempt to evade capture by fleeing to another city had ultimately failed. When Tillery was brought before a judge, the decision about bond was swift and definitive. He would be held without bond. This wasn't surprising given the severity of the charges, but it also reflected the court's assessment of him as either a significant flight risk or a continued danger to public safety. His flight to Raleigh after the murder had already demonstrated his willingness to try to evade consequences. The charges filed against Tillery reflected the full scope of his alleged crimes. He faced felony murder charges for Montasia's death, assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill for the attack on Montasia Arrington, firing into an occupied dwelling, and possession of a firearm by a felon. Each charge carried serious potential penalties, and together they painted a picture of someone who had brought extreme violence into what should have been a safe space. The investigation had moved quickly from crime scene to capture, but the questions it raised about systemic failures would linger much longer. How had someone with Tillery's criminal history been able to post bond after a knife attack? What more could have been done to protect Montasia once his pattern of escalating violence became clear. Understanding Montasia Tillery requires looking beyond the moment he pulled the trigger. At 23 years old, he represented a dangerous intersection of risk factors that should have set off alarm bells throughout the system. His history wasn't just troubling, it was predictive. The sexual battery conviction involving a 14-year-old victim revealed someone capable of targeting the most vulnerable members of society. The felonious restraint charge showed his willingness to use force to control others. These weren't youthful mistakes or momentary lapses in judgment. They were deliberate crimes that demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior. When Tillery was released from prison in 2019, he entered a world where his status as a registered sex offender was supposed to provide a layer of community protection. The registry system exists specifically to help law enforcement and community members identify individuals who pose documented risks. But registry systems only work when the people who need the information know to look for it. Montasia's relationship with Tillery began sometime after his release, which means she became involved with him during the period when he was supposed to be under enhanced scrutiny. The registry was public information, available to anyone who wanted to check. But domestic relationships don't typically begin with background checks, and many people don't think to search sex offender databases when meeting new partners. This created a tragic information gap. Montasia was making decisions about her safety and her son's well-being without access to crucial information about the man she was dealing with. She knew he was capable of violence. The knife attack had made that abundantly clear. But she may not have known about his conviction for crimes against a minor, information that would have provided essential context about the level of danger she faced. The legal proceedings against Tillery moved forward with serious charges that reflected the gravity of his alleged crimes: felony murder, assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, firing into an occupied dwelling, and possession of a firearm by a felon. Each charge carried significant potential prison time. Together, they represented the possibility of life behind bars. But here, the public record becomes frustratingly incomplete. Despite extensive research by our team at Truly Criminal Network, specific details about Tillery's trial proceedings remain largely inaccessible through standard public record searches. This isn't unusual for relatively recent cases, particularly those that haven't reached appellate courts or generated extensive ongoing media coverage. North Carolina maintains public portals for court records, but accessing detailed trial information, evidence presentations, and final dispositions isn't always straightforward. The complexity of court record systems means that crucial information about justice outcomes often remains buried in databases that require specialized access or physical courthouse visits to navigate. This information gap creates a significant challenge for understanding whether justice was ultimately served in Montasia's case. Without access to trial transcripts, sentencing records, or appellate filings, we cannot definitively report whether Tillery was convicted, acquitted, or reached a plea agreement. We cannot describe the evidence presented, the witnesses who testified, or the jury's deliberations. What we can examine are the systemic questions this case raises about risk assessment and public safety. Tillery's background created a complex risk profile that combined intimate partner violence with a documented history of sexual offenses. This intersection should have triggered enhanced scrutiny when he was arrested for the knife attack on Montasia. The decision to release him on a $40,000 bond, despite his criminal history and the documented escalation of violence, represents a critical failure point. Bond decisions are supposed to consider both flight risk and public safety. Someone with Tillery's background, facing domestic violence charges involving a documented pattern of escalating violence, should have been assessed as presenting an unacceptable risk to community safety. This case highlights the need for better integration of information systems. When judges make bond decisions, they need immediate access to comprehensive criminal histories, including sex offender status and patterns of violence against intimate partners. The fact that protective orders and bond decisions can be made in isolation from each other creates dangerous gaps in victim protection. The intersection of domestic violence and sex offense history creates a particularly dangerous risk profile that current systems aren't equipped to handle effectively. Domestic violence experts have long recognized that the most dangerous time for victims is when they try to leave abusive relationships. When the abuser also has a documented history of sexual violence, that risk profile should trigger additional protective measures. Montasia's case also raises questions about information sharing between different parts of the criminal justice system. Registry information exists to protect communities, but if that information isn't being effectively integrated into domestic violence risk assessments, its protective value is diminished. The absence of detailed trial information means we cannot report on whether these systemic issues were addressed during legal proceedings. We cannot describe how prosecutors presented the case, whether Tillery's criminal history was fully considered, or what ultimate accountability was achieved. What remains clear is that this case represents far more than a single tragic incident. It reveals systemic vulnerabilities that put other potential victims at risk. Montasia's death should have been preventable, and understanding why it wasn't requires honest examination of the failures that allowed it to happen. The legal system's response to Montasia Tillery will ultimately be judged by history, even if those details remain hidden from public view. But the lessons this case teaches about protecting domestic violence victims cannot wait for complete information. On April 30th, 2022, 11 days after her death, family and friends gathered at H.D. Pope Funeral Home in Roanoke Rapids to say goodbye to Montasia Renee Arrington. The visitation and funeral service became a testament to the profound impact she had made in her 20 years of life. The overwhelming attendance spoke to the connections she had forged throughout her community. Following the service, Montasia was laid to rest in the Royster Family Cemetery, surrounded by the ancestors who had shaped the values she carried throughout her life. Even in death, she remained connected to the family heritage that had given her strength. The outpouring of grief extended far beyond the formal ceremonies. Candles were lit in her memory by countless community members, each flame representing someone whose life had been touched by Montasia's warmth. Tributes poured in from Brenda and Albert Simmons, Phyllis Alkane, Alvin and Linda Anderson, Nettie Martin, and her best friend Ashanti Jefferson. These weren't just condolences, they were celebrations of a life that had brought joy to everyone who knew her. Teresa Arrington, recovering from her own injuries, faced the impossible task of rebuilding life without her daughter while caring for her traumatized grandson. Jacian, now 3 years old, continues to be surrounded by the same network of love that supported his mother. His extended family has ensured that he remains connected to Montasia's memory through stories of her laughter, her devotion to family, and her unwavering love for him. The preservation of Montasia's memory goes beyond family gatherings and photo albums. Her legacy has become a rallying cry for domestic violence advocates who recognize her story as representative of systemic failures that affect countless victims. Her case has been officially categorized among domestic homicides in North Carolina, placing it within broader statistical patterns that demand attention from policymakers and law enforcement. Domestic violence advocacy groups have used Montasia's story to push for critical reforms. They argue for stricter enforcement of protective orders, pointing out that legal documents without enforcement mechanisms provide false security. They advocate for re-evaluation of bond amounts for violent offenders, particularly those with histories of sexual offenses or escalating domestic violence. The intersection of Tillery's sex offender status and domestic violence history has sparked conversations about improved risk assessment protocols. Advocates argue that when these risk factors combine, standard protective measures are insufficient. They call for enhanced information sharing between different parts of the criminal justice system to ensure that judges making bond decisions have complete pictures of the dangers involved. Montasia's case has also highlighted the need for better support systems for domestic violence victims navigating legal proceedings. Her story demonstrates that following proper procedures and trusting the system isn't always enough to ensure safety. This has led to calls for enhanced victim advocacy services and more comprehensive safety planning that accounts for the limitations of legal protections. Beyond policy discussions, Montasia's legacy lives on in the daily choices her family makes to honor her memory. They speak of her happiness, her infectious smile, and her capacity for love. They ensure that Jason grows up knowing not just that his mother died tragically, but that she lived joyfully and loved fiercely. The broader community of Littleton continues to grapple with the loss of someone who represented the best of their small-town values. Montasia's death forced uncomfortable conversations about domestic violence, about the effectiveness of protective systems, and about the responsibility communities bear to protect their most vulnerable members. Her story refuses to be just another statistic. Instead, it has become a catalyst for change, ensuring that her death serves as a foundation for protecting other young mothers facing similar dangers. Montasia Renee Arrington's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes doing everything right isn't enough. She left her abuser, she sought legal protection, she surrounded herself with family support, she followed every piece of advice given to domestic violence victims. Yet she still lost her life to the very violence she was trying to escape. Her case reveals the dangerous gaps that exist between the promise of protection and the reality of safety. A protective order becomes meaningless when the person it's meant to restrain can post bond and walk free. Registry systems fail to protect when information isn't effectively integrated into risk assessments. The very institutions designed to help victims can inadvertently enable their attackers. But Montasia's legacy extends beyond the failures that cost her life. Her story has become a powerful advocate for change, pushing for reforms that could prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Every policy discussion about domestic violence, every conversation about protective order enforcement, every examination of bond decisions for violent offenders carries forward her fight for safety. At Truly Criminal Network, our team believes that understanding these cases requires more than just recounting events. It demands honest examination of the systems that shape outcomes. Montasia's story challenges us to do better, to demand more from the institutions that promise protection. Her son, Jason, continues to grow surrounded by love, carrying forward the joy and warmth that defined his mother's life. In him, Montasia's legacy lives on, not as a victim, but as someone whose life mattered enough to change how we protect others. If cases like Montasia's make you believe we can do better, join our community by subscribing and sharing these stories. Because remembering victims like Montasia means committing to ensuring their deaths weren't in vain. The question remains, how many more protective orders will fail before we strengthen the systems meant to save lives?